It's 2 o'clock. What's going on? Hi, and welcome to the show. This is LaGuardia Web Radio, WLGR. My name is Hugo Fernandez. The show is What's Going On. And today my guest is Ricky Riccardi, who is the Louis Armstrong House Museum's Director of Research, Collections, and the world expert on Louis Armstrong. Say hi, Ricky.
Hello, Hugo.
uh, and I explained to Ricky that it's a bit, the show is bizarre in the fact that one of the things is I keep trying to play this song in as many ways as Marvin Gaye recorded it. And then we'll see, and I'll probably move on to covers eventually. But I was looking for the connection between Armstrong and Marvin Gaye. And though I could not find Armstrong performing this, I did find in my research that Stanley Crouch, who is another great scholar of jazz, you may have seen him on the jazz documentary, Ken Burns documentary, mentions that he believes that Gaye was influenced by Armstrong in his phrasing of the mother mother father father part. You want to weigh in on that, Ricky?
I mean, anybody that's performed music since about 1928 has either been directly influenced by Armstrong or even unconsciously influenced by him. His innovations, especially as a vocalist, which people sometimes take lightly, he basically invented how to sing pop music and jazz and everything else. So there is, when I hear Marvin Gaye, when I hear Sam Cooke, and there's an interview with Sam Cooke in the 60s, he names Louis Armstrong as his favorite singer. It's more than just jazz. I think that whole soul generation, Ray Charles, James Brown, they're all coming out of Armstrong. Everyone's coming out of Armstrong.
Whether they know it or not.
Exactly.
Well, before we go into speaking about Armstrong, when you refer to him, do you refer to him as Pops, as Satchmo, Louis?
I'm a Louis guy, actually.
Louis.
I don't judge, though. I'll say that right up front because sometimes people get touchy about this. But if you asked him what his name was, he would always say Louis. And he actually gave interviews. He said, "My mother never called me Louis." When he did Hello Dolly, the producer of Hello Dolly had the idea that Armstrong should change the words and sing Hello Dolly, it's Louis Dolly. And apparently Armstrong shouted back, "It's Louis."
Yeah.
And when you hear that record, he sings, "Hello Dolly, this is Louis," and he holds that S. So because he tended to prefer Louis, I tend to prefer Louis. But having said that, all of his wives called him Louis. All of his musicians, all of his friends called him Louis. He recorded songs, Louis's Dream, Laughin' Louis. So I don't think Louis offended him. But if you asked him what his name was, he would say Louis. And so that's what I tend to go with. But musicians called him Pops. The world called him Satchmo. As long as you're talking about him, I'm happy.
Yeah, and I think I always tell my students when you speak of somebody, unless you know them, you call them by their last name. You say Armstrong.
Right.
So maybe I'll say Armstrong for this.
Yeah.
I didn't know him as Louis. But let's talk a little bit about you first. You want to talk a little bit about yourself, your background,
sure,
and your studies?
Yeah, so I was born in 1980, so 9 years after Armstrong. Just setting the scene because I never met him or knew him either. Born and raised in Toms River, New Jersey, and pretty much from the moment I came out of the womb, 1980, I was not very interested in popular culture after 1980. As soon as I was coherent, I was listening to Motown records and Elvis Presley and Little Richard, the late Little Richard. That was my childhood. It was like 50s rock and roll, a lot of Motown, old stuff. Then I got obsessed with old television shows, old movies, black and white movies, old comedy. So this is where my brain was in the mid 1990s. And when I was about 15, I was going through a Jimmy Stewart phase, which not many 15-year-olds were going through in 1995. And I rented the Glenn Miller Story, a 1954 movie in which he played the famous big band leader. And here comes Louis Armstrong. And because of my kind of pop culture obsession with the 1930s and 40s. I knew of Armstrong, but I never really paid attention. He came out and he did one song, Basin Street Blues, and just that one 5-minute performance was enough to really pique my curiosity. I said, I need to know more, read more, learn more about this guy. So I ended up at the local library here in Toms River, and blindly I selected a cassette tape, 16 most requested songs. So, all right, that sounds pretty good. And that one cassette was like the big bang. That no music had ever really hit me between the eyes like that. And so at that point I figured, all right, now I need to read everything. I need to learn everything. I need to know everything about this guy, because this guy is just incredible. And at the time, the standard Armstrong narrative was grew up in poverty in New Orleans, changed the sound of music in the 1920s, but then he goes commercial. He's a sellout. He's an Uncle Tom. He's smiling and doing Hello Dolly. He's no longer a genius, and what a waste of a career. And so about 2 years later, this gigantic Armstrong biography came out. It was about 500 pages, and it only covered the last 30 years of Armstrong's life in about 70 pages. The first 420 pages for the early stuff, and then it went like fast forward. And so I was still in high school. I thought, like, you know what? Everyone's missing a story. I think this later stuff is great. I think he's a wonderful trumpet player and a great musician. And I'm listening to all these recordings with Ella Fitzgerald, and Lewis plays Fats Waller, and this is tremendous. And I said, someone needs to write a book about Louis Armstrong's later years. So flash forward, I ended up getting a bachelor's from Rutgers University in journalism, but then I got my master's degree at Rutgers in jazz history and research. And so day one, Louis Porter is a fantastic jazz historian. He's asking the class for thesis topics. And I said, Louis Armstrong's later years. And he was very impressed. He said, you know what? No one's ever really written about the later years. You got it. So I spent the next 2 years researching, interviewing surviving musicians, people who knew him. I wrote a 350-page thesis, graduated in 2005, and basically hit a brick wall. I thought I had taught some undergrad jazz history. I was playing the piano a lot at the time. I'd written a few things. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'll piece it all together and make a career. Nothing was happening. And so I went back to my old summer job. My father in Toms River is a painting contractor, and that used to be my summer job in between the school years. I would go back and help the old man paint houses, office buildings, medical buildings, that kind of stuff. Long story short, I ended up being a full-time house painter for 4 full years with my master's degree. But during that time, that's when I got really serious about the research aspect of it all. And so I began going to the Louis Armstrong archives at Queens College and uncovering all this precious unknown stuff, mostly from Armstrong's own tapes. I hired an agent in New York City. A buddy of mine had just published a book, and he put me in touch with his agent, a guy named Tony Athwaite, and we put together a book proposal. And then I started an Armstrong blog in 2007, where I would write 2 or 3 posts a week just about Armstrong, about his music. And for a while, nothing was really shaking. The book was getting rejected left and right. Nobody was reading the blog. I'm still painting houses every day. I had just gotten married.
Ricky, one second. I don't know if everybody else is noticing this, but you've just turned green.
Oh,
I don't know why.
No.
Oh, there you go. You're back. Thank you.
I've told the story. I got sick to my stomach.
No, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So long story short, it all fell like dominoes. 2009, my agent called. I got a book deal with Pantheon to do the book on Lewis's later years. Because of the blog, I got invited to New Orleans for the first time and give a bunch of Armstrong lectures. And then in 2009, the Armstrong Archives they had a job opening to be an archivist. And even though I had no library training, I knew the staff pretty well there. And I said, if I'm ever going to work anywhere, it needs to go there. And so, I lived happily ever after at that point. But I do talk to a lot of students all the time, and I tell them, that those 4 years there of house painting every day with my master's degree, getting rejected, it was brutal. But at the same time, I always believed that this was important work. And between starting my blog and doing other things to kind of get my name out there, developed just enough of a reputation to get my foot in the door. And now it's been about 10 full years of working my dream job. My second Armstrong book is coming out this summer. And yeah, teaching Armstrong courses, producing Armstrong reissues, giving lectures, talking to people like you. That 15-year-old kid in Toms River never could have imagined any of this happening.
And you've transitioned to do our second quarter hour, which is coming to the museum. What's the title, though, of the new book that you're working on?
The new book is going to be called Heart Full of Rhythm, The Big Band Years of Louis Armstrong. So the first book was What a Wonderful World, The Magic of Louis Armstrong's Later Years. And that book was Armstrong's life from 1947 till his death in 71. And that was the period I really wanted to bust open and explore in detail that I had never seen in any other previous Armstrong book. And then the more time went by, I realized that nobody really paid attention to his big band period also. And this is the period where he really becomes a pop star and breaks down many barriers for his race, and really, it's an incredible period. And so this book is going to cover 1929 and it's going to end in 1947. So I never planned to work backwards this way, but now my mind is already planning I need to do a book and cover his birth until 1929. And then I'll have the whole life covered in 3 books. But right now, at least, 2/3 of it will be there.
I've always threatened that would be a way to teach history, which is, because students are always caught up with the contemporary, that you begin with the now and you work your way backwards to understand, well, why are we doing this way? And so you go back whatever period of time. And so you start realizing, well, this was going on, things like that. So why not in your career? Since you've already talked about going to the museum and beginning to work there, tell us about, what do you do at the museum, and maybe talk a little bit about the museum itself, what people would expect to find when they go.
Sure. Yeah. The museum right now, it's kind of a 2-part operation. There's the actual museum, which is Louis Armstrong's house. It's where he lived for the last 28 years of his life, in Corona, Queens. The unfortunately named Corona, Queens, and which is, not helping things right now. The museum is closed because of COVID-19, but it's been open to the public since 2003. No one's lived there since the Armstrongs. Everything is 100% original. It's a National Historic Landmark. And so that's really the main operation. That's open 5 days a week when we are open. And people come from all around the world, see the house. They hear audio clips in each room. There's a docent that takes you through and tells you stories. It's wonderful. But the other end of the operation is kind of my domain, the archives. And that's actually located at Queens College. And how that happened, Louis Armstrong died in 71. His widow, Lucille, saved everything. And she died unexpectedly in 1983, left everything to the city of New York. They said, well, someone needs to administer this. And so Queens College stepped in. They said that they would administer the house. And then the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation, that's the Armstrong estate, they had possession of all of Louis's tapes and papers and everything that was found in the house. They donated it to Queens College. So it's kind of touching that we're actually talking about this right now, because Michael Cogswell was really the architect of he passed away about 2 weeks, and we're still kind of mourning his loss. Michael was hired as the archivist in 1991. He opened up the Armstrong Archives in 1994, and then he was made the director of the whole organization. And he raised the money and opened up the House Museum in 2003, and then he raised $23 million. We're actually building an Armstrong Center that's going to be opened up hopefully next year right across the street from the house. So Michael is no longer with us, but without him, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't have this job. So I just wanted to take a second and thank Michael Cogswell. But so what it is now, the archives where I work started out with just Louis Armstrong's collection, which was unbelievable. Reel-to-reel tapes and scrapbooks and his sheet music collection, his record collection, trumpets, mouthpieces, you name it. Michael made the decision in 1994 to keep collecting. If anybody out there has anything related to Armstrong, if he wrote letters, if your grandfather took photos, if you have a bootleg recording, whatever it is, send it in. And so it grew and grew and grew. We began acquiring private collections and this and that. And so we now have 13 separate collections of all Armstrong material. It's the only thing we collect, and it's the world's largest archives for any single jazz musician. So for me, on a daily basis, I will, I'm in charge of all that stuff, which is just a trip. I can't even tell you, pulling the trumpets out. And when a famous trumpeter comes, that's one thing. VIP trumpeters could be Wynton Marsalis, could be John Faddis. They'll stop by if they want to play the trumpets. We will bring out Louis Armstrong's trumpets, and they'll play them. Researchers from around the world, anybody working on Armstrong projects, Ken Burns, his team, when they did the jazz documentary, they spent months there using all of our photos. I do all the social media for the Armstrong Archives and the Armstrong House. I should mention that about 4 years ago, we got a $2.7 million grant from Robert F. Smith's Fund to Foundation, which digitized the whole collection. So that was quite a process getting it all digitized, but it's all available now. And we'll talk later on about different ways we're using that during the pandemic. But that's the archive side of it. And between the archives and the house and the new building when it opens, it's going to be kind of our little version of Graceland. We're dreaming of the day that people can come to Queens and come to 107th Street in Corona and take a tour of his house, see the archives, see a state-of-the-art exhibit area, the whole thing. And so we're about a year away from that, but it's happening.
It's interesting when you mentioned that, because one of my little I'm a photographer. So one of the things I do is I did recently, like when I went to Cuba, I photographed the Hemingway house. I have a thing about artists' homes and studios, and what you can, by taking pictures of it, what you can figure out, what the traces left behind. And I started thinking about, wow, wouldn't it be great to take pictures in the house? And when you mentioned Graceland, is a very famous book by a photographer named William Eggleston, color photographer, who basically would show up at Graceland at night, the only time he would have complete access and photograph. And it's a really fabulous book. But it's all mixed up into Elvis and his tastes and
Oh,
things like that.
sure.
I'm sure in the case of Armstrong, it's about those things that he held on. It kind of amazed me, because I know that first of all, he was a musician, right? He traveled a great deal. Obviously, he had to be constantly traveling. He had a lot of difficult relationships, which is
Sure.
even management.
Yep.
The Ken Burns documentary goes into that, and so his ability, the fact that he was able to hold on to these things. But I do know that Lucille created that anchor by buying the home with her own money, right, and
Yep.
giving him a place that he could come to. And I'm wondering if that's or if he was able to somehow hold on to all these other things over time in other ways. But I would guess that a lot of it was started amassing once he did have that home as a place to be able to. And she gave him his space. The den was his space, right?
That was
For
it.
him to. The recordings, in fact, that we're going to be listening to, were made in the den with his own reel-to-reel, right? His own tape
Oh,
deck.
yeah.
And
Yep.
so that gave him the ability to start really kind of amassing a lot of this stuff. But what about that? Do you think did he ways to hold on to things even in the years when he was traveling and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, early on, we have stuff like the earliest scrapbook we have is from the late 1920s, when his career was just starting to really gather steam. He actually talks about on one of the tapes, he would clip out anytime he was mentioned in the newspapers, and he paste it into a scrapbook, and then he would take that around, and that would help him get work. He would be like, "Oh, here's my resume," and so we actually have that scrapbook. He spent a couple of years in Europe in the mid-30s, brought back a lot of records, a lot of European records from the mid-30s, a lot of photographs he saved. He made multiple scrapbooks in the 20s and 30s that survived. But you are right. It's once he gets to Queens, once he has the den, that's when the collection really multiplies. Buying his first reel-to-reel tape deck in 1950, that was a game changer. We have about 750 tapes he made in those last 20 years. Scrapbooks he continued to make, collages that he made at home in Queens, because he was on the road about 300 days a year, when he was at his peak. And so a lot of the house is Lucille's. She did not want to be cooped up in an apartment. She did not want to be living out of a suitcase. She did not want to be living in hotel rooms. But he fell so in love with the neighborhood, and the home was more. Yeah, you kind of have to see it to believe it, but it was more luxurious than anything he had ever had. He grew up in just abject poverty, outhouse in the backyard, the whole thing.
The
Just
Battery, right? Is that what it was
oh,
called?
the battlefield.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
yeah, it
exactly.
was. Oh, I mean, his whole childhood is just. You have to read the book Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, to kind of really understand it. And
Mm.
so he gets to Queens, and this is not a mansion. This is not a private estate in Long Island or something. This is a working class neighborhood, your typical Archie Bunker house. but he just fell in love with it. It was more than he had. The neighborhood was integrated. There's kids all over the block, and that was it. So every time he was home, he wanted to be in that house. He wanted to be on that block, getting his hair cut at the barbershop, buying ice cream for the kids and all that stuff. When people visit the Armstrong house, like I said, when you visit Graceland, you learn a lot about Elvis and his tastes. And it's the same thing when you visit the Armstrong house, just making that subway, taking the 7 train to Queens, walking through the neighborhood, getting there, you're already in his mindset. Like, this is what this guy wanted.
And you talked about the relationship between Queens College and the museum. Do the faculty and students take advantage of the archive as part of that relationship?
They do, maybe not as much as we would like them to. We've been open now 25 years, and we're still kind of like a hidden gem, where students walk by us in the library every day and have no idea what it is. But there are some very hip teachers who do know. And the funny part is most of them aren't even in the music department, and Armstrong's life, because it's such a rich life. And to me, it's like the definitive 20th century life. We've had English classes come, we've had art classes come to look at his collages, media classes come to see Armstrong transition from records to radio to film to television, everything else. So his life does touch a lot of things on campus. One thing I've been fortunate enough to do is I just finished actually last night. I've been teaching a Music of Louis Armstrong graduate course at the music school on campus for students getting their master's in jazz performance. And that's been a dream because, kind of go back to my opening point, everybody knows Armstrong. Everybody knows he's important, but in some ways, he's almost like the spinach of the jazz world. Like you have to eat it. It's good for you. But a lot of the young musicians, they want to get right onto John Coltrane and Chick Corea, and let's get a little more contemporary. And they hear Armstrong's 1920s recordings with the scratchy sound, and they're like, that's old music. And so jazz education has kind of lost its way over the years, and that they followed suit, and they teach the students, okay, Louis Armstrong is important in the 1920s. You should listen to the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. You should know West End blues. But after that, don't worry about it. You just move on. And so to be able to get a 15-week course with professional musicians, performing musicians, touring musicians, recording musicians, and none of them have really checked out Armstrong. After 15 weeks and visiting the archives, I make them go to the house. I make them listen to the tapes. We have listening every week as their homework and reading a couple of books. They get it. They get it. I've never had one student, I don't think, who did not emerge from that class, unmoved by Armstrong's music and story. So anything I can do to educate the students of Queens College or anywhere about Armstrong's importance, I'm there for it.
Hey, you make me want to take that class. But we're at the halfway point. It's almost 2:30, so just a little station break. You're listening or watching as well to LaGuardia Radio WLGR. The show is What's Going On. I'm your host, Hugo Fernandez, and my guest today is Riccardi, who is the Louis Armstrong House Museum's Director of Research Collections and the world expert on Louis Armstrong. And let's talk about the genesis of this show. Was actually as a result of the mentioning on the Monday Briefs email that goes out from CUNY Central about things that are happening. And they talked about the fact that the museum was releasing digitally for folks to listen to personal recordings Armstrong had made, interviews he'd done with folks. And that pricked up my ears because, I've done a little bit of that myself with my father, for example, and over the years as a broadcast when I studied broadcasting. So that's exciting to hear, you catch somebody in a more natural setting talking about whatever different aspects of their lives as well as their music. Do you want to talk a little bit about, why now, where the initiative came from, and what and is it tied to COVID-19, all these kinds of different things? Oh, by the way,
yeah.
We also have 2 recordings that we're going to play. So if you want to, Chris has them ready to play. Chris Pope, our engineer. Nice. So maybe we could play a couple of those cuts.
Oh, definitely
as well.
Yeah.
Talk about the project or the idea.
Sure. No, it's the kind of thing. I'll say up front, if I had to choose, I would rather there was no COVID-19. I would rather be at the archives and museum right now. Having said that, um, this is the kind of thing that we would never have done without the pandemic. We just didn't have time. I mean, we're a very small staff. The museum has tours and school groups every day. I work all day at the archives. Always projects coming in, researchers coming in, and myself and our archivist Sarah Rose, we had the conversation a few times about virtual exhibits, and we had actually talked to Google about doing something, but just, like I said, just never enough time. So COVID-19 hits, we closed down the museum, we closed down the archives, and now we're just all looking at each other like what do we do? We are a place where the archives has the physical objects, and people come to do research because they want to see the papers and see the trumpets. All right, we're out of business. What about the museum? People coming, tourists coming from all over the world, school groups coming every day. There's nowhere for them to go. And so for about a week there, it was kind of like touch and go. Like, what do we do? Are we going to get furloughed? And what's going to happen to the staff? And then I mentioned Sarah. She had the first idea. Maybe now we should explore a virtual exhibit. I said, all right, let's see. Do some research. How can we do that? And then our acting director, Jeff Rosenstock, he actually had the idea. He goes, yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't we make the theme home? That, everyone's stuck at home right now. What did Louis Armstrong do when he was home? And the answer, as I mentioned, make tapes, make scrapbooks, write letters to fans, all this kind of stuff. And I'd mentioned earlier, we digitized the whole collection. And that's really the secret ingredient. If we didn't get that $2.7 million grant from Fund to Foundation to digitize everything, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, because everything is digitized. It's all in the cloud. I have access to it all. And so that was the final piece of the puzzle. We had the idea of virtual exhibit, make the theme. We call it That's My Home, which is one of Armstrong's songs. And we have content galore. And I'm so proud of the staff because everyone really kind of jumped in. We all pitched in. And so the way it's been working is every Monday we post a very long, very detailed, content-heavy post with audio clips and maybe videos and copies of his writings and the themes we've covered so far. Yesterday we put up a big one about Louis during the Civil Rights era, him telling off Eisenhower, his problems with the African American community, this and that. We explored it from all angles. Last week was one on the neighborhood. We just called it Our Neighborhood, and we put up all these manuscript pages of Louis writing about the neighborhood in Queens, writing about getting his hair cut and all this kind of stuff. The week before was Louis's collages. We've done what's in Louis Armstrong's record collection. We've done tapes of him practicing at home. We did a 2.5-hour interview that Louis did where we have the audio. We just put the whole audio up there of him and two friends in 1965 in the den, just talking about music and everything. So it has re-energized all of us. That's every Monday, I should mention. Every Wednesday, we've had our gift shop manager, Highland Harris, is a respected jazz historian, drummer, educator. And so I did a series of video interviews with him, and we've been posting those up in snippets every Wednesday. So he's kind of commenting on Louis and on the exhibit. And then every Friday, we pick one selection from Louis's record collection and put it up there, put up a Spotify link, maybe put up some extra materials if Louis wrote about the record or if he introduced the record on tape. So we've been averaging about 3 posts a week for almost 2 months now. And the reaction has been incredible. And like I said, the staff is kind of re-energized, very engaged. We're already come up with ideas of Louis in comedy, doing features on Lucille, this and that. So we still have no idea when the house is going to open up or when the archives are going to open up. But this is a way for us to get the word on the street about what we do, about Armstrong's life, about his legacy. And it seems to be working. We posted it on social media today. It kind of blew up. I want to read it just to get the headline proper here. But let's see. Everyone knows Billie Eilish, of course. There's this is the headline of an article this morning. Quarantine Culture Report. Louis Armstrong is trending. Billie Eilish is not. And so, no disrespect. I'm not going to start a war with Billie Eilish. We posted it, and some of her fans jumped all over us. We did not mean it to go that direction. But the point of the article is that people are home, and instead of pop music and stuff like that, they're starting to explore classic novels, classic movies, classic music. And there's a website that tracks the searches and the histories and the what people are interested in. And it said interest in Armstrong is up 19% since the pandemic. And so we're feeling like it might just be people reading, listening to What a Wonderful World. It might be people checking out our exhibit, but whatever it is, almost 50 years after he's gone, he is still kind of guiding us through. He guided us through the Great Depression and World War II and Vietnam and the Civil Rights era. And it's like people are still turning to Armstrong's music because it, fills them with joy and warmth and comfort, even in the middle of a pandemic. So it's all coming together, and we're still, being able to do this even during these trying times. It's incredible.
Yeah, and when you were talking, a few things came to mind. One of them is that I remembered one of the posts was about Armstrong had a Jelly Roll Morton album, and I started. One of our faculty actually has been writing a Jelly Roll Morton musical. I don't know what she is. Lisa Despain, who teaches music. She's a jazz pianist, but she's been doing this thing about Jelly Roll. So that was one of the things that popped into my head. But what I wanted to do is Chris Pope, who was our engineer, has one of these recordings. Let's play one of them. And I will say to the audience before Chris plays, and Chris is going to have to tell us via chat that, like I'll say, Chris, please play the chat, and he'll have to tell us after it's done since we can't necessarily hear it. But that those folks who will be able to hear it, that if you take issues with dicey language, that you are fair warned. All right. Of course, he was a jazz musician, and he was home. So, but Chris, can you play? Let's play the first cut for us. I guess it's going to be hard for us to.
And turn your television, your thingamajigger. And what the shit? You got that fucking thing on? Hey.
Honey, what you going?
Turn your red tape recorder off. Don't be fluffing me off.
I got thousands of tapes.
I wouldn't give a shit about your thousands tapes. You can come with them tomorrow. Turn your tape off. In fact, erase out some of that shit.
Oh, you getting nervous now.
I ain't getting nervous, but you ain't, you ain't got no better sense than...
Posterity.
Posterity my ass. You got no better sense than play that for some of your, not even friends. Somebody that come in here that you don't even know.
Thanks. Hey, Chris, can you, for a second, undo your mute and tell us which one you played? Which cut was it? Because he's got two. Okay. Thanks, Chris. So, yeah. So he used to let this thing run, and I think she used to take issue with this, right? That he would have this recording tape going on all the time, and he would capture her as part of it.
She usually knew. It's funny. He usually told people who was recording it. It was kind of part of the atmosphere. But that particular tape, I think it's the most important tape we own, because that clip there comes at the end of about a 10-minute argument where they are really going at it and cursing and resentments. I mean, it's brutal. And in this case, she doesn't know he's tape recording it. And so to me, the moment that she discovers it, which we just heard, and tells him to turn it off, and then tells him to erase it, and he says, no, that's for posterity. To me, right? That is the moment. That's why we're having this conversation. It's why we have an archives. It's why we have it all. He knows that even in this moment at 5 a.m., when him and his wife are tipsy and they've both been yelling and cursing at each other for 10 minutes, one day this might be interesting to history. Right. Yeah, so Armstrong is, I always tell people, the most down-home, humble, down-to-earth genius imaginable. But he also was very aware of what he did and what he accomplished and what he overcame to accomplish it. And he would tell friends, they're going to write about me in the history books one day. And so I think making these tapes was his way of being in control of his own story, knowing that one day people like me, who never met him, born almost a decade after he died, I was able to listen to these tapes, and I feel like I know him better than I know some of my family members, because it's all there. It's uncensored. It's the real deal. And you can't find that anywhere else. You can't find that with Duke Ellington or Miles Davis or any of the other great geniuses of jazz that their whole life, at least the last 20 years of his life, is on tape. It's unbelievable.
And it's also that lesson about, and this is good for archivists, but also filmmakers, like cinema verite filmmakers, is you just got to let it roll. Because if you get into this turning it off, turning it on, thinking this is the important, you miss so much. Because I try to do recordings. People don't like it. People don't like it when they know they're being recorded, but you hope they forget, and eventually they tip their hand. They share something that's valuable. Chris, why don't you play us the next cut, please?
At home in Corona, Long Island, New York.
Notice no one is playing.
February 26th,
got a chat to us.
1956.
February 6th.
Correction.
Chris?
February 6th, 1926.
Yeah.
CW with
Oh, it's the second.
1956.
Oh, you played it already?
Pardon me, folks. Luceria messing with my eye, you know.
Yeah, sorry, you got to cue me with the chat, Chris, or else because we're cut off. This is one of the technical things we've got to figure out. So he uses that, but he uses that phrase posterity, right?
Yeah.
Oh no, it's about the date.
The date.
Sometimes, let's just say this too, which I found out through the documentary. Louis Armstrong smoked marijuana every day of his life, right? Is that not the case?
He did.
Which I think is, that's something to say. Look, if he could do it, it's possible, But of course, it worked for him, his lifestyle, his whatever, what he was doing. Obviously, you don't want an air traffic controller,
no.
but engaged in that kind of behavior, necessarily, at least on the job. And I'm not, I'm guessing he probably smoked when he played, but.
Early on, he did. If you listen to some of his recordings from the early 30s, you could tell he is high as a kite, and he brags about it. He has little code words and secrets that he gets across there. Later on, it became more of he actually used the word of medicine, kind of a way of dealing with life on the road and racism and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, like that clip there. It's funny, right before it starts, you do hear him coughing quite a bit, so it's possible he had just inhaled. But I love that because that is a great little insight into the marriage. I mean, Lucille is the helpful wife in the background correcting him on the date. He keeps getting it wrong. But we play that clip every day for people who visit the museum.
Oh, yeah.
In the living room, which is where it was recorded, and and it gives people the chills because it feels like they're still with us.
Well, yeah, you're there with him. And we're actually moving into the last quarter hour. So the one thing I'm going to do is Jamie Riccio, who is our station director, is also monitoring the Twitch stream. And the Twitch does afford folks that they can ask questions. So it looks like we've got our first one. She heard me. And so let's see what it says. So it's from Jeff Barber. Yeah, Ricky and Pops. Tuesday just got a whole lot better. So I guess that's somebody who's grateful for what you guys are sending out. And then this next one is, can you tell me a bit more about the museum's collections? What's your favorite place in the archive? And on that note, what's your favorite factoid or piece of history to teach about Louis?
Ooh, boy. I'm good. If you say favorite 100 factoids, I'm better at that than one. I don't know if this is a factoid, but I think it's a fact. And this is always the number one thing I try to instill in people's heads is that there's been a million great instrumentalists and a million great vocalists, but Armstrong's the only guy you could find who is equally influential as a trumpeter and as a vocalist. He changed the way people played music on their instruments. There'd be no Charlie Parker, no Jimi Hendrix, and he changed the way people sang. There'd be no Frank Sinatra, there'd be no Billie Holiday, no Marvin Gaye. And so for one guy to do that, and I say that as a fact, more than a factoid, because I think no one would dispute any of that, especially if you hear where pop music was before Armstrong. The archives, my favorite objects, and it's kind of a no-brainer, but are the trumpets. The trumpets are in the safe. I don't see them every day. I don't see them every week. But when they do come out, I've been there 10 years now, and there's never been a time where I've taken it for granted. Like, oh, I got to get the trumpets again. No. Every time I hold them, every time people visit, sometimes they might ask and take a picture with them, or just to hold one, or just to see them and watching their reactions. That's incredible. In terms of the collections, Armstrong's personal collection, the collection that's the kind of the cornerstone, the tapes, the scrapbooks, all that stuff, that's the greatest. There's nothing else like that. On a personal note, though, I think my other favorite collection is the Jack Bradley collection. And this guy, Jack Bradley, who's still with us, he's 86 years old now. Jack met Lewis in 1959 and became his best friend. Lewis used to call him my white son, but Jack, he was his cook, his driver, his marijuana contact. But Jack was also Lewis's personal photographer for those last 12 years. And he was never obnoxious about it, but Lewis liked having him around, and Jack always brought a camera. So he would shoot Lewis at home, shoot him backstage, shoot him at the recording dates, shoot him on the bus, shoot him with fans. And so in 2005, the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation purchased Jack Bradley's Armstrong collection, the world's largest private collection of materials, and donated it to the archives at Queens College. And so that's actually why I was hired. I mentioned I don't have a library background, but I saw the position as an archivist to be in charge of the Jack Bradley collection, and I knew Jack Bradley. That was my number one reference on on my application, and so I got the job. And again, all thanks to Michael Cogswell. He knew it would be better to hire an Armstrong expert and teach him how to catalog than to hire the world's greatest librarian and teach him everything about Armstrong. And so just a quick story, when I was going for the interview, the Jack Bradley collection was in shambles. And so Michael reached into a box and pulled out a handful of contact sheets. And he goes, "This is the stuff you'll be working with." And he showed me a contact sheet. He had like 9 photos on it. And I took one look at it, and I said, "Oh, that's a Mercury recording date from the fall of 1964. And Michael and the search team, they looked at it. There was no words or anything. They're like, "Well, how do you know?" I said, "Well, that's Big Chief Moore on trombone. That's Eddie Shue on clarinet." And that edition of Armstrong's band was only together for 6 months. And in those 6 months,
You're
and the 2
hired.
record dates, within hours, I was hired. And so Jack's collection, that was my baby. I was hired only as a 2-year grant just to get Jack's collection arranged, preserved, cataloged, made available to the public. And then they kept me on full time after that. So, but like I said, we have 13 collections. So any aspect of Armstrong, personal, private, anything in between, we have it covered.
You were the Phil Shapp of Armstrong. Phil Shapp is the Parker man. What I was going to say,
we lost Hugo. Hello, everybody. Am I still on, Chris? Well, I'll tell you another story. Well, I don't know if I'm on here, but all right. I'll just keep talking. Another collection we have is a guy named Gösta Hagloff. He was a Swedish man. I got to know him pretty well. He was a banker by day, but any moment he wasn't at the bank, he was devoted to Armstrong. He wasn't a musician or anything. He just devoted to Armstrong. He wasn't That's all right. That's okay. Should I keep going? Am I broadcasting? Okay. Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, so the guy Gösta Hagloff, he wasn't a musician. He'd put together bands. He would put together concerts, tributes, recording dates, all this stuff. And he met Armstrong once in 1965. They had a nice 2-hour conversation. And then he wrote a letter. There he is. Okay. I'm just telling the story. I'm talking about a Swedish collector, a guy named Gösta Hagloff, who was so obsessed with Armstrong. He once told me he never got married because no woman was going to put up with his level of Armstrong worship. And Hagloff wrote a letter to Armstrong in 1971, and Armstrong wrote back and said, "Keep up the good work." And then he passed away a few months later. And so Hagloff, became his life's mission. And he collected everything he could find and did all these beautiful tributes to Armstrong. And he died in 2009, but he left his collection to a museum. And so I mentioned Michael Cogswell. Michael had to go over to Sweden, pack up the entire collection, bring it back. And just like that, we had Europe's largest Armstrong collection as well. And I know there's more out there. If anyone out there is listening And if your family or your friends or your neighbors, your grandfather, grandmother has a photo of Louis Armstrong, a letter that he wrote, a story, a connection, find us at the museum or at lewisarmstronghouse.org or on social media, because that's the stuff we live for. We really do.
Yeah, I think the reason I was just going to say that the reason I think I froze is because I just became, I started an account on Skype, and maybe it had some sort of 40-minute thing, or maybe that's from Zoom. So I apologize for that. But I was going to say the factoid that I hold on to about Armstrong is that he wore the Star of David every day of his life as a way to say thank you to, was it the Karnofskys?
The Karnofskys, yeah.
Who bought him his first trumpet, who took care of him, gave him a job when he was a child on the coal wagon. They'd know the coal truck was coming because he'd blow the horn. And that was there's actually a great photograph of Armstrong by Gary Winogrand where he's backstage. He's got a shirt off, he's wearing like an A t-shirt, and there's the star. And I know that's why Winogrand, he was Jewish, and he saw that and it was just like boom. What Roland Barthes calls the punctum, the little detail in the photograph that grabs you. Yep. So yeah, he was a special man. We're down to our last few minutes. I don't see any more questions coming in. So I was going to say, in wrapping up, any last things you'd like to say or talk for a second about the future? We've got about 5 minutes before I put on the last cut and we're out.
Yeah, I should give the URL. I never did that, but virtualexhibits.lewisarmstronghouse.org. That's where the new site is, which we're calling That's My Home. And I mentioned we have so many ideas to keep going. So every week we're hoping to keep up that pace of 3 new posts a week. And until we have any prediction of when we can open up the museum and archives, at least you can keep visiting that site and hear these tapes and look at these photos and read his writings and kind of explore Armstrong's life in a way that was never really possible before. It's one of the silver linings, I guess, looking for positive spins on what is a terrible crisis. At least we're able to do this.
I wouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden after the pandemic is over that you would get this kind of mass influx of folks who had been tuning in through the site and wanted to go there and see. I mean, I became aware of it through Jay Hershenson at Queens College, and I used to know him through CUNY Central, and talked it up. And whenever I was working on the CUNY Cultural Initiative and trying to encourage colleges to take advantage of cultural things that are close to them within their communities, and I would say, you got the Louis Armstrong House in Queens. That's, that pops, the greatest American artist of the 20th century, and that's coming from a visual artist. Okay. And so obviously I would like to go there whenever I get the opportunity, when everything settles down. But I just wanted to, we're almost done, so I just wanted to kind of say thanks to you for being on the show and giving us your time. This is as good as, we had a Nobel Prize winner on a show once in the previous incarnation. So, but this tops, I don't know if I could say that, but it possibly tops that.
I won't tell them.
And I also wanted to say, Michaela, and how do I pronounce her last name? Is it Michaela's last name? She handles your publicity?
I know she's watching right now, so I don't want to get it wrong.
So you're not going to say it? You let me do that? Michaela, I wanted to say thanks to Michaela who put us together. And, once again, I just sent a blind email, how would you like to do the radio show? And she made it happen. And for that, and thank you. And any last things you want to say, or anybody you want to thank?
Michaela's part of the Surefire team, and I mentioned that Billie Eilish article saying that we got Armstrong is 19% more popular now. I think a lot of that is Surefire getting the word on the street about this whole virtual exhibit thing being in the Washington Post and being all over the place. It's unbelievable that we could even get publicity in the middle of a pandemic, but I really think people are looking for positive stories, looking for inspirational stories, looking for triumph, looking for anything to get their minds off of this, and ways of. And Louis Armstrong checks all those boxes. So as long as we're all breathing, Louis is there for us.
Yes, and we miss him.
Oh, tremendously. Yeah.
Well, again, I just want to thank you for being on my show. You've been listening to and watching what's going on here on LaGuardia Web Radio, WLGR. My guest today has been Ricky Riccardi, Louis Armstrong House Museum's Director of Research Collections, and he is the world expert on Louis Armstrong. And you have a standing invitation to come back on the show and talk again with any the next initiatives.
Yeah.
Thank you for being on. And
my book will be out in, I think, August or September. So maybe I'll come back.
Come back on it. We'll talk about the book.
That'd be great.
And I'll read it. I would, when you talked about it, I just remembered a few times you mentioned it when he played for Fletcher Henderson.
Oh,
and,
sure.
And he actually left Fletcher Henderson because he didn't think the guys were serious enough.
Right. Right.
So he took his music seriously.
And he had tremendous self-confidence. He always said Henderson had $1 million talent in his band, and Henderson wouldn't let him sing. He wouldn't really feature him.
He thought he was too black, right? He thought.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Exactly. There's the lesson.
And so, Louis got the last laugh there. So.
And thanks to my audience for listening. We're going to take you out as we came in with Marvin Gaye. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you.